Welcome to Lives Beneath History. Isabel de Córdoba sits at a scarred wooden table, her fingers stained with ink, pressing the royal seal into warm wax as the heat of New Spain settles around her. She serves as assistant to a colonial notary in the 17th century, copying deeds and recording the transfer of land in a world ordered by parchment and law. While estates expand and boundaries are fixed in careful lines of script, her own family remains without title to the soil they work. In the quiet discipline of her hand, the future of fields and families is set down in ink. This is her story. The wax did not cool fast enough in the heat. Isabel held the small brass seal just above the parchment and watched the red wax soften at the edges before she pressed the mark into it. The room smelled of tallow and dust and the faint sourness of ink that had sat too long in its pot. Outside the open window, a mule brayed in the street. The sound carried up through the courtyard and into the notary's office, where the air was already thick by mid-morning. She pressed down firmly, careful not to tilt her wrist. When she lifted the seal, the impression of the royal arms was clear. She exhaled quietly and set the instrument back on its folded cloth. The document lay flat on the wooden table, weighted at the corners by smooth stones to prevent the parchment from curling. Her handwriting ran in steady lines beneath the notary's larger, more practiced script. She had copied the formal phrases exactly, the names, the measurements of land, the obligations attached to it. A sale confirmed, boundaries described, witnesses recorded. She sanded the ink lightly and tipped the sheet so the excess grains fell back into the small box. The rhythm of it soothed her. Dip the quill, draw the line, blot, sand, shake. Don Alonso, the notary, shifted in his chair behind her. His joints made a faint clicking sound when he moved. He cleared his throat. Is the boundary clause complete? Yes, senor, she said without turning. From the mesquite at the northern edge to the arroyo that runs in the rainy season. 3 caballerías in total. He nodded, though she only saw the movement from the corner of her eye. He trusted her with these details now. She knew the forms as well as he did, perhaps better in some respects. She had copied them for years. A thin line of sweat traced down her spine beneath her linen shift. She resisted the urge to shift in her seat. It would not do to smudge the page. Now, through the doorway that opened into the courtyard, she could see a pair of men waiting on a bench beneath the shade of a jacaranda tree. One wore a woolen jacket despite the heat, his hat resting on his knee. The other was dressed more plainly, with sandals of woven leather and a cotton tilma folded over his shoulder. They did not speak. They watched the door. Isabel recognized that look, waiting to see if the written word would confirm what had already been decided elsewhere. She finished the final line and carried the document to Don Alonso's desk. He leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles, and read in silence. His finger moved along the margin where she had noted the prior claim to the land an older grant made under a previous viceroy, now superseded by purchase. He grunted softly. It is correct, he said at last. Call them in. Isabel stepped into the courtyard. The sunlight struck her face with sudden force. The dust in the air glowed pale. She gestured to the men. They will see you now. The man in the wool jacket rose first. He had the posture of someone accustomed to command, though his boots were scuffed from travel. The other followed more slowly. Inside, the heat pressed close again. Isabel stood at the side table as Don Alonso read aloud the essential terms. The buyer nodded at each point. The seller's eyes remained on the parchment. Isabel could not tell if he followed the Spanish precisely or only recognized the structure of it. He did not interrupt. When it came time to sign, the buyer took the quill with confidence. The seller hesitated, then made his mark as he had been instructed, a simple cross beside his name, which Isabel had written earlier from dictation. She had learned to observe hands. Hands revealed more than faces. The buyer's fingers were ink-stained from his own accounts. The seller's were rough, with field work, nails broken, skin cracked at the knuckles. When the transaction was complete, they left without speaking to one another. Isabel gathered the documents and laid them flat to dry. She would copy the essential details into the bound registry before the day ended. The registry was heavy, its leather cover worn smooth at the corners. Each page bore the weight of decisions like this one: land transferred, obligations assigned, labor promised. She ran her palm lightly over the stack of completed pages. They felt cool now that the ink had set. Her family owned no such parchment. There was no record bearing her father's name in this office, except for a small debt recorded years ago when he had borrowed to replace a broken plow. That debt had been repaid, though slowly. Isabel had helped. She returned to her seat and prepared fresh ink. The rest of the morning passed in similar fashion. A contract of apprenticeship for a boy of 14. A dowry agreement between two families of modest standing. A petition requesting confirmation of water rights for irrigation. Each document required precise language, each clause built upon earlier ones, as if the colony were layered not only in stone and adobe, but in sentences. By midday, the air had grown stifling. Don Alonso dismissed her to take food. She wrapped her shawl over her head against the sun and stepped into the street. The city moved in slow currents. Carts creaked under sacks of maize. Women balanced baskets on their hips. A group of soldiers passed, their breastplates dulled by dust, swords at their sides, more from habit than immediate need. Isabel kept her eyes lowered as they went by. The plaza lay ahead, its stone arcades casting strips of shade. Vendors called out the price of fruit. The smell of roasted chilies mingled with that of damp stone near the fountain. She purchased a small tortilla and a wedge of cheese from a woman she knew. They exchanged brief greetings. Isabel did not linger. She preferred to eat in the quieter space behind the office, where a narrow strip of shade hugged the back wall. As she chewed, she considered the morning's sale. 3 caballerías, enough land to graze cattle for years. The boundaries would be walked and measured. Stakes would be set. Fences perhaps built later. Her father had once spoken of land in such terms. He had described, in careful detail, a small plot near their village where the soil held moisture longer than elsewhere. He had hoped to secure it under his own name, but the title had never come. The land remained attached to a larger estate, granted long ago to a man who had never set foot upon it. She remembered walking beside her father at dusk, her skirts catching on dry brush. He had pointed with his chin toward a distant line of trees. There, he had said, if it were ours, we would plant beans first. They'd take well to this soil. She had been young then, more concerned with the feel of the earth under her bare feet than with legal claims. Only later did she understand the weight of the word if. A bell rang in the distance, calling the faithful to prayer. Isabel wiped her hands and returned inside. In the afternoon, she began the registry entry for the land sale. She wrote in smaller script, conserving space, date, names, description. She copied the exact phrasing used in the original deed. Accuracy was protection. If disputes arose, the registry would be consulted. Her wrist ached slightly as the hours passed. She paused to flex her fingers. Don Alonso watched her from his desk. "You write a steady hand," he said. "Better than some clerks I have known. Thank you, Señorinit." "It's a skill," he continued, "that brings security." She inclined her head. Security for whom? She did not ask. He returned to his own papers, drafting a letter to the audience there. Isabel dipped her quill again. Toward late afternoon, a small group arrived without prior appointment. 2 men and a woman, their clothing plain, faces drawn. They removed their hats upon entering. "We come regarding the boundary of San Miguel," one of the men said. Isabel felt a tightening in her chest. San Miguel was an estate whose records she knew well. Its owner had been expanding his holdings steadily, purchasing small parcels and petitioning for confirmation of older grants. Don Alonso gestured for them to sit. "What is the matter?" The woman spoke this time, her voice low but steady. "The new markers have been placed beyond the old stones," she said. "They cut across the path to our fields." Don Alonso frowned. "The markers were set according to the most recent survey," he replied. "They were not there before," the man insisted. "We have always used that path." Isabel kept her eyes on the page before her, but she listened closely. She knew the survey in question. She had copied it 2 months earlier. The description had been precise, but the terrain uneven. It would not be difficult for a marker to shift in interpretation. "Do you have written proof of your prior right?" Don Alonso asked. The man hesitated. The woman looked at her hands. "We have used the land since my father's time," she said. "Before, usage is not title," Don Alonso replied. Silence settled heavily in the room. Isabel's thoughts moved carefully. She knew the limits of her place. She was assistant, not advocate, yet she also knew the registry. She knew that an earlier entry mentioned an access path retained by the neighboring villages when the estate had first been confirmed. She could see the page in her mind, the margin note, the faint correction where Don Alonso had amended a phrase. She weighed the risk. To speak might be seen as presumption. To remain silent would allow the conversation to proceed along its present course. Her father's voice returned to her, describing that small plot near the trees. If it were ours. She cleared her throat softly. "Senar," she said, keeping her tone respectful. There was an earlier clause regarding right of passage when San Miguel's boundaries were confirmed after the flood year. Don Alonso looked at her sharply. "Which year?" "The year of the heavy rains," she replied. 3 years passed. It was noted that the villagers retained access to the path east of the arroyo. He studied her for a moment, then rose and moved to the shelf where older volumes were kept. Dust rose as he pulled one free. Isabel felt the eyes of the visitors upon her. She kept her gaze lowered. Pages turned. Don Alonso's finger traced lines of ink. At last he paused. "Here," he murmured. He read aloud the clause she had remembered. It did not grant ownership, but it did affirm access. The woman exhaled audibly. "The markers must reflect this," Don Alonso said. "If they do not, a correction will be made." The men bowed their heads in gratitude. The woman met Isabel's eyes briefly. There was something there, relief, perhaps, or simple acknowledgement. When they had left, Don Alonso returned to his desk. "You must be certain when you speak," he said. "Yes, sinner." He regarded her a moment longer. It was well remembered. She inclined her head again. The rest of the day passed without further interruption. When the sun began to sink and the shadows lengthened across the courtyard, Isabel closed the registry and tied it with its cord. She cleaned her quill and covered the ink. As she stepped into the street, the air had cooled slightly. The city's noise softened into evening sounds. Distant laughter, the clatter of dishes, the low murmur of conversation from open doorways. She walked toward her family's dwelling at the edge of the city, where adobe walls leaned close together and the ground was uneven. Her mother sat outside on a low stool, mending a shirt in the fading light. "You are late," her mother said, not unkindly. "There was a dispute," Isabel replied. "It is resolved." Her younger brother crouched nearby, carving a piece of wood with careful strokes. He looked up as she approached. "Did you write many pages today?" he asked. "Several." He nodded, as if this were a measure of something he understood only partially. Inside the room was small, but orderly. A woven mat lay in one corner. A clay pot simmered gently over coals. Isabel removed her shawl and washed her hands in a basin. As they ate, her father spoke of a neighbor who had been required to provide labor on a distant estate under the repartimento system. The journey had taken him away from his own fields for weeks. "It is lawful," her father said quietly, "but it leaves little time for one's own work." Isabel listened. She knew the term well. She had copied obligations of labor into contracts, noting the number of days owed, the compensation promised. On parchment, the system appeared orderly. In life, it was less so. After the meal, she sat beside her mother and took up the mending needle. The thread moved in and out of the fabric with steady rhythm. "Don Alonso says writing brings security," she said after a time. Her mother smiled faintly. For him, perhaps. Isabel did not argue. She thought instead of the registry volumes stacked in the office, each one a quiet authority. Land could change hands with ink and seal. Paths could be preserved or erased by a clause remembered or forgotten. She considered her own position. As assistant, she occupied a narrow space within the machinery of the colony. She did not command soldiers or govern provinces. She did not own estates. But she touched the records that affirmed such power. It was a modest influence, and one that required caution. In the days that followed, she worked with heightened attention. She reviewed older entries when time permitted, noting patterns. Estates that grew, villages that shrank, names that appeared repeatedly as buyers. She did not deceive herself into thinking she could alter the course of all transactions. The law was structured, and she was bound within it. Yet she recognized moments when precision mattered. A boundary described clearly, an access path recorded explicitly, a labor obligation written without ambiguity. These were small acts, but they accumulated one afternoon. As she copied a grant of land to a newly arrived settler from Spain, she paused over the description of a stream that ran through adjacent fields used by local families. The wording was broad, capable of swallowing more than intended. She adjusted the phrasing slightly, clarifying that the grant extended to the stream's western bank only, as indicated in prior surveys. The meaning remained faithful to the source documents. The settler would not likely notice the distinction, but it preserved a narrow strip of water access for those already dependent upon it. When Don Alonso reviewed the page, he made no comment. Isabel felt neither triumph nor fear, only a steady awareness of the balance she walked. At night, she sometimes lay awake, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood, a baby crying, a dog barking, the distant toll of a bell. She imagined the future recorded in the pages she had written. Fields planted or abandoned, houses built or collapsed, children inheriting claims. She did not know whether her own family would ever hold a title in their name. The cost remained beyond their means, but she understood now that land was not only soil, it was words, measurements, and memory bound together. One evening, as she sealed a final document before closing the office, she noticed a thin crack in the wax. The impression remained legible, but imperfect. She warmed the seal again and pressed it more carefully into a fresh drop. The second mark held firm. Outside, the light was fading. Dust settled in the courtyard. Isabel tied the cord around the day's completed papers and placed them in their proper place. She paused a moment, her hand resting on the leather cover of the registry. The volumes did not speak. They did not question. They preserved what was written within them. Isabel turned down the lamp and stepped into the street, carrying with her the knowledge that ink could both confine and protect. In the narrow space allotted to her, she would continue to write with care. In the chronicles of empire, viceroys, conquerors, and bishops command the page, their names carried forward in bold script. Yet the colony also rested upon quieter hands, upon those who measured, copied, sealed, and remembered. Isabel did not lead armies or govern provinces, but she shaped a record that determined who would walk a path, draw water from a stream, or claim a harvest. Her influence was narrow and seldom acknowledged, yet it endured in every clause she set down with care. Long after voices faded and disputes quieted, her steady lines of ink remained. In the space allowed to her, she preserved more than transactions. She preserved balance where she could. Thank you for listening to Lives Beneath History.